In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Steven Speicher, a pediatric hematologist, oncologist turned digital health leader, who now also heads clinical oncology at Flatiron Health. With advanced training in systems engineering and biodesign, Steven's mission is clear: use technology to make care safer, smarter, and more human. He also serves as the vice chair for the EHR Association's AI task force and is one of the most thoughtful voices I've ever met navigating the future of AI in healthcare. We talk about what it actually takes to embed safety into innovation, how Flatiron is transforming the EMR from a documentation tool to a tool that doesn't just record care, but helps deliver it, and why physicians and technologists both underestimate how hard the other's job really is. Steven shares why ambient AI isn't just about saving time, it's about leveling the playing field and bridging the gap between academic innovation and frontline community care. If you're building for providers, scaling AI in healthcare, or just trying to bridge the clinical product gap, this episode will hit home. Let's dive in. All right, let's get right into it. So please welcome Dr. Steven Speicher to the podcast. Hey, Steven, nice to have you today.
I'm excited to be here.
So let's kick it off with just, learning a little bit about you and starting with your journey. Can you kind of share with us, who you are and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. No, I've had an interesting journey as a physician. I ended up on the tech side primarily. And so it's definitely been an interesting journey. So I would say my journey into healthcare started when I was really young. I was raised with a younger brother who had a lot of special healthcare needs. And so I grew up in a very tangential way to the healthcare system. I didn't have parents that were doctors. I didn't have family members that were doctors, but definitely experienced healthcare through the eyes of a sibling and watched my mom primarily really navigate through a very complex medical system. So I think from a young age, I realized that I really wanted to get into healthcare and figure out a path forward there. When you're young, the most obvious thing is, oh, you should be a doctor. Like that makes perfect sense. And so kind of went full steam ahead into medical school and then into my residency. I had spent some time at a camp for children with cancer and their siblings, and so really developed a love for the oncology community and taking care of those particular types of patients and kind of being able to be the central hub for those families. And so decided to pursue a fellowship in pediatric hematology and oncology. And quickly realized that while I was very interested from a clinical perspective, that, my initial interests were really in how do you make healthcare, more accessible, more kind of user friendly, if you will. I, kind of harken back to those early memories as, having my family deal with all of my brother's special healthcare needs, and try to figure out, okay, what could this look like if I'm not going to be a full-time clinician? I spent a few years after my fellowship doing a couple of different things, learning about doing a master's in a discipline known as systems engineering for healthcare, and then ultimately started to get my eye set on technology as kind of this great facilitator of healthcare and something that I thought had a ton of promise. And wanted to get a little bit more in the weeds there. So did an innovation fellowship at UCLA where I was working on medical device and a digital companion app, and got really interested in this kind of intersection between healthcare delivery and digital tools and trying to understand, how do I make a job out of this, right? So I think it's not something that traditionally was well understood, but started to take a look at what opportunities there were out there and really where do I kind of leverage my clinical skill sets with these new interests that I have. And I happened upon Flatiron Health and I've been at Flatiron for the past 5 years in a couple of different capacities, and I'm really enjoying kind of my time on the kind of healthcare technology side. A lot of people will know Flatiron as really kind of the pioneer in real world evidence for oncology. We're primarily, depending upon what kind of form you know us in, as kind of this data company that really helps to solve really interesting problems in the kind of drug development space, clinical research space, leveraging our technology and our data. And I work specifically on the point of care side. So we have a electronic medical record for community oncology practices, OncoEMR, and I oversee our clinical and safety programs for the point of care solution. So I found a really interesting kind of opportunity to kind of triangulate this, the technology piece, the clinical piece, and then the overall my kind of desire and interest in making healthcare more accessible, better for patients, better for providers, and really kind of enjoying this intersection.
Yeah, I thought, when we spoke, I thought you just had an incredibly interesting kind of journey getting, from the clinical side now to the technology side, but still having a clinical lens to it. And I'm really excited for the conversation that we're about to have based off of, some of the discussions that we've had before. But I think just to kind of put it into more context, I was wondering if you can walk us through kind of like, what does your day-to-day, look like leading clinical and safety at Flatiron? And how does that kind of fit into Flatiron's like bigger vision?
Yeah, I mean, it's so different than what I was trained to do, right? I think, and so the majority of my friends are, practicing physicians, and their days are pretty well understood in what they're going to be doing, what they're going to be seeing. And I've had this opportunity to lead a clinical team for a electronic medical record company. We do a variety of different things. So I have clinicians anywhere from, oncology nurses, pharmacists, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, who are working right alongside our software developers to make sure that we can really translate those needs of the clinician, needs of the patient directly into what that needs to be from a product perspective. We also, in maintaining an electronic medical record, there is a very robust amount of clinical content that we need to manage. So everything from the regimens that are being ordered, the drugs that are being ordered, the codes that are, being inputted. And so we have a team of clinicians that are helping to get all of that, ingested in the appropriate way, make sure it's represented in the appropriate way, QA all of that. And then ultimately, our goal is to make sure all these things are safe. So, have some safety oversight where our product teams are, trying to better understand what does it mean to prioritize patient safety, and how do we ensure that our tools are not, imposing new safety risks, but actually improving the overall safety profile of the care that's being provided. So, my day is kind of managing all of that, managing relationships with our customers, and ultimately just trying to remember, my primary goal is to continue to be the voice of the clinician, to be the voice of the patient. A technology organization, a product organization, they are trained in how to build stuff, right? And so ultimately, I try to get in there with my team and really make sure that we're storytellers. And first and foremost, we're trying to tell the story. We're trying to make sure that those needs and desires and wants of the patient and the provider are front of mind, and that the developers are taking their role really seriously. I think that anytime you have developers on the product and end side that are deciding to come work at a health tech company, I think they're doing it because of the opportunity to work on something with a vision and with a mission. And so it's really cool to see them really engage in the storytelling and engage in just trying to understand, okay, what does this mean for a provider, right? I'm making these adjustments. I'm making these changes to the user interface. What does that actually mean for the provider and for the patient that's being treated?
So, Stephen, I think, the role that you have in healthcare is so important, especially coming from like the technology side. Like the amount of things that I've learned that I wouldn't have just picked up by talking to doctors, by talking to our users, and really kind of learning what are some of the nuances in like the workflow that really matter to the end user. I'm curious if you can kind of share, what were some exciting projects that you worked on? What were some moments of enlightenment where you thought you were really able to kind of share something that to you was like obvious, but maybe to the developer or the product team, it was like not so obvious.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think, and the point you make about one of our primary roles on the clinical team is really learning how to translate those clinical needs and what is a workflow and be able to translate that for a development team. I think it's something that both the development teams and the clinicians that work for health tech companies have had to like kind of learn each other's language a bit. And I think, when we coming out of, the majority of my team came straight from practicing medicine and working directly for a healthcare clinic. So they don't think in terms of clicks and workflows and user interface and, all of those things that the development team is constantly thinking about. So I think that one thing that we've really gotten really good at is being able to take problems that our clinicians we're hearing from our clinicians and not just like not repeat those, right? Like clearly there's a mistranslation there, but like how do we take the problems that we're hearing from our end users and translate that in a way that will make sense for the development team? I think like as far as projects that I've been, most kind of engaged in and interested in, I mean, what's so great about, so I at Flatiron, we have an oncology specific EHR, which means that our EHR, is really just used by oncologists for the treatment of cancer patients. And so that has allowed us to really dig into our user base in a way that other EHR providers really aren't able to, right? So if you have a general ambulatory EHR or something that's not specialty specific, you're not able to really solve very specific problems for the end user. I think like we have been able to develop technology that serves our end users specifically that would not exist for other specialties. An example I can think of is we have drug substitution functionality where we are able to, at the regimen level, help a provider make a decision on which specific drug, because we have, often most people know about like generics and brand name drugs, and oftentimes there's the same efficacy, but one of them is preferred for a specific payer or for a specific reason. And so we're able to help build technology that allows a provider to seamlessly change out those medications that have no, bearing on the patient's actual treatment plan or disease, but that are mutually beneficial for the practice and for the insurer and the payer and on all of those different stakeholders. We also, one of the cooler tools that we built out recently, not so recently at this point, but we've had for a while, is something that looked at the max lifetime dose of specific chemotherapeutic agents. So there are specific chemotherapies where when you start to use it over and over and over again, we see, certain toxicities related to issues related to the heart or issues related to the lungs. And oftentimes there's no visibility as the end user of when we're getting closer to that max lifetime dose. So we built functionality that was able to calculate out the, how much, what is the kind of milligram or milligram per meter squared dosage of these medications that have been given to a patient over all of the different treatments. And are they approaching kind of that idea of that max lifetime dose to drive efficacy, to drive safety, so stuff like that, where we're really able to solve what seem like very small but very specific problems for our oncologists is something that is incredible. I love getting to kind of roll that out, and then when we go and implement that at a new practice, when a practice goes live on OncoEMR, it's like some of my favorite things to do are to show our providers, here's the, this max lifetime dose calculator. Here's how we calculate, chemotherapy doses to make sure that they are safe for you. And that's functionality that really, unless you have a specialty specific EHR, is going to be really hard to build out over time.
Yeah. And that's something that I love, right? Like, I think one of the big challenges that I see a lot of the time is that you have information that's available that would actually really help the care that you're delivering to the patient. But the diffusion of that information is sometimes extremely difficult, especially when they're buried in a lot of these medical journals, and they really need to kind of get out the word out that, maybe guidelines have changed, or maybe there's a new kind of, max lifetime dosage for a specific chemotherapy. And, the technology that, you guys are building, it really demonstrates how you can actually have technology speed up the diffusion of a lot of this research into the fingertips of the providers and actually change the way they're delivering care, which is just so awesome to see.
Yeah. And I mean, the reality is oncologists need this like level of technological advancement, right? Like I think of, obviously I'm going to be biased towards oncology, but when I think about a specialty that changes as much as oncology does, with recommendations, with drug development, with, new drugs being approved for different indications, with dose changes, with, testing changes of we should be testing for this, and this, it's extremely overwhelming. And the reality is that most oncologists that are outside of academic environments are more or less generalists. So they are taking care of breast cancer patients, colon cancer patients, sometimes leukemia patients as well. And so to be able to stay up to date on all this information, all these guidelines is fully unrealistic, right? Like I think that there's no way for the human brain to be able to not only learn all of this when you're training, that's one thing. And maybe the day you finish training and fellowship, you've got all this information in your head, but then how do you maintain that going forward? Change things that are changing. You're not, sitting in a classroom every day, you're taking care of patients. And I think that's where technology really has the opportunity. And we really, as technologists, need to lean into our responsibility there to make sure that these providers are able to get this up-to-date information, into their fingertips at the point of care and be able to take care of patients in a way that drives quality for them.
Yeah. I think I read a quote that the volume of medical data doubles every 73 days. And, to think about the challenges of, like you said, staying up to date on everything, it almost becomes an unsurmountable task, right? If you think about it. And I think that's where really the opportunity for AI and technology to really help aid in that effort. Um,
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of talk about one of the things that we've partnered on together. So, Flatiron has been partnering with us at DeepScribe to integrate ambient AI into OncoEMR. And, kind of coming off the tails of what we were just talking about, I'm curious to get your take on like, where do you see this going, right? Like, how do you think ambient is going to change the way we deliver care, not just from kind of a workflow perspective, but more from a clinical perspective? And also, how do you think that changes kind of the role of the EHR itself?
Yeah. First and foremost, I'll tell you, I'm so excited about this partnership and just kind of like being able to leverage this technology in the way that we are already. Right. So I think that like I have been practicing medicine long enough to have seen such a transformation in how technology is integrated into healthcare delivery. Like I was during medical school, I was kind of thinking about this as I was preparing for the, our chat. Like I was, the hospital I was working at, we were using paper charts still. We were actually part of the first year where they were transitioning over to the first electronic medical record. And then in through my residency was still at some clinics that were, still using paper charts. And so and that was not all that long ago. And to see how far we've come to where now, the majority of healthcare is practiced using electronic medical records, has been tremendous. But then, the reality is that technology has existed for a really long time. There was nothing kind of novel about the technology that kind of that was needed to power an electronic medical record. So it's been a really long time, if ever, that we've seen kind of digital technology take off in this way in the healthcare space. And I don't think we've ever seen anything this transformative. We see technological advancements all the time in drugs being developed, in therapeutic, opportunities, in testing, in diagnostics. But like this digital advancement has never, in my mind, occurred until kind of the last several years with artificial intelligence being kind of well adopted. So, first and foremost, just want to like kind of relay my excitement, on the electronic medical record side as we're able to really leverage this technology in a way that is beneficial for our providers. They desperately need it and are excited and they're ready to utilize it. As far as like where does it go from here, right? Like I think the biggest barrier to entry with a lot of these things is things like change management. So I think before we rolled out DeepScribe to our customers, before we roll out any tool, my product managers, they lose sleep at night thinking about like, how is this going to be received? Am I going to be, the hero that, oh my gosh, you solved this incredible problem? Or am I going to get screamed at being like, you are making my life more difficult. My life is already challenging. Like, please turn this off immediately. And when we roll out something as like revolutionary as artificial intelligence, my mind was spinning on like how are providers going to perceive this, right? So, as a physician, I feel comfortable saying we are very change averse, and we are very unwilling to adopt things that are not going to make our lives easier. Healthcare and medicine is very difficult, and they do not want anything that's going to make their lives more difficult, which I totally understand. So, when I think about like those initial days of rolling out the DeepScribe solution to our providers, we were really worried. I remember when we first kind of showed some of our providers at one of our big kind of internal conferences some of this technology. I will say the excitement on their face was like palpable, right? Like you could feel how excited they were. Oh my gosh, if this can save me some time, if I can get through seeing my patients faster, if I'm not doing some of this administrative work, this will make my life so much easier. So, first and foremost, we needed to see how this was adopted to even know what the future of this partnership and what the future of AI and the EMR could look like. We're still relatively early into this rollout, but what I will say is that I have been so pleasantly surprised by the general sentiment and by some of the metrics that we are seeing as we think about the kind of adoption of DeepScribe into Onco EMR. We're seeing notes being signed faster. We're seeing charge capture being increased and that with a high degree of fidelity. So these charges that are being surfaced are ones that our providers are saying, yeah, these are in fact things that we need to kind of these diagnostic factors need to be incorporated into the chart. So a high degree of fidelity into that, and then just anecdotally in talking to our providers, I don't go a week, I rarely go a day where I'm not getting direct feedback from our user base saying like this is something they are very excited about. So, with that, it's like, okay, what is next? Like, how can we, now that we've kind of more or less made them believers that this AI stuff is real and that we can make your life easier, where do we start to find the highest value for our providers, for our patients, for kind of the global healthcare system? For me, I always go back to some of the general sentiment that, so the AMA had a really interesting survey that they put out related to provider sentiment and artificial intelligence. And, the first, second, and third thing that providers are saying that they want, it seems like, is stuff that's going to decrease administrative burden. I think that is the thing that leads to burnout. It is the thing that drives providers crazy. Things related to like documentation that helps with prior authorization, things related to documentation that helps with referrals, anything that is making their kind of hours between, the time between the hours of, 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. more difficult, where they're not at home with their families or doing whatever it is that they love to do. That is where they're just like desperate for innovation. And so, with now us capturing these visit notes and having kind of information directly from the electronic medical record, the ability to really expedite some of these administrative workflows, whether they are billing and documentation for different disease states, diagnoses, comorbidities, all of those things to make the chart more robust, more comprehensive, to ease, billing burdens, to ease kind of, compliance within value-based care programs. All of those things are going to be things that are going to be very well received in the provider community, in my opinion.
Yeah, we're busy building it, so
yeah. We're excited to roll it out. So, as fast as you guys can get it to us, please.
I wanted to double click on one of the things that you said, because I do think it's a really important point. I think a lot of times you have transformative technology that is met with a lot of reticence. And, at the same time, those that are sometimes the most reticent are the ones that are in fact have the most need, right? They have the sharpest pain that this technology would solve. And I think especially in the community space, that pain is, really sharp, but they often have the least amount of time to be evaluating new technologies, to be able to test things and, pilot new innovative ways in their workflow. And so, I wanted to kind of just double click on that real quick. If you can kind of share with us and kind of the listeners, like, how do you think you solve that? Like, what is the fix to get this technology out and sooner and convince those that's, sometimes are the most busiest to adopt new technology?
Yeah. A few thoughts. I think I want to make sure I highlight again and again the point that you made on the need for advanced technology, especially things like this that are going to drive efficiency, potentially things that drive, better understanding of the changing guidelines and clinical complexity. Those are really needed in, when we're talking about oncology, at least in the community oncology space. So, something I kind of chatted or, talked about a little bit earlier was, this idea of those that are practicing in the community oncology setting are normally have to be, fairly general in their treatment of a variety of different diseases, right? So when you're at and I, grew up kind of trained in a highly specialized academic environment, you may be seeing not only just one specific type of disease, but like a subset of that type of disease, right? So you're not only just the leukemia expert, you're the AML expert, for example, at an academic center. In a community oncology setting, you're seeing whatever walks through your door, right? So you have to be able to keep up with the pace of change. So all of that medical information, how do we get that to the point of care? We talked about that a little bit, but also like, how do we drive efficiency for them? Because their lives, their day-to-day is so packed full of different things. They're wearing so many different hats. They're seeing so many patients. So we need these technologies and these tools to do that. To your point, they often don't have the infrastructure and the time and capacity to test and vet these products, in the same way that a larger health system can. So I think there are a couple things that we can do to help drive adoption and kind of drive, utilization of these tools in like more rural or community oncology settings and just broadly, right? Not even just oncology, but just broad community settings. I think that, a couple things come to mind. I think that like we have to, as technologists, when we're providing tools to smaller practices, to kind of what people would think of as like private practices, community oncology, community practices, rural clinics. We have to recognize our responsibility as the technology vendor in support of what they're doing, right? So we have to, I believe fully in this idea of shared responsibility between the technologists and the providers to assess the integrity and validity and quality and safety of the tools. But I think it's so important as technology vendors to recognize that like, hey, this is a drastic need. We're trying to address this need. There is a built-in assumption on the part of a lot of these providers that we're doing the testing. We're making sure this is high quality. We're building culture into our companies that make sure our software engineers understand the implications of this, right? Like what happens if this tool does not function correctly, if this tool breaks? There are lives on the line, right? Like not to be dramatic, but like we have to ingrain that in the culture of the development teams and our engineers and all those people building the tools, because we're trying to support a team of or set of providers that don't necessarily have that time, skill set, expertise to be able to vet all of those things. I will also say, like, I think it's important for us to be as transparent as possible with our community oncology specifically practices in what our tools can do, what they cannot do, what we're testing, what we're exploring, and use them as partners. Like really look at it as a partnership model with these providers to say, hey, we want to build this tool for you. What do you need to see from us to feel good about these tools being used in the wild, if you will? I think that there's also, there's a ton of stuff in the regulatory space, making sure regulations are not overly burdensome for the providers. There's a lot of regulatory action that's aimed directly at the clinics and the providers to stand up, robust systems for testing that. That's going to be really hard for a one doctor, two doctor practice of any kind to be able to do that. And then I also we need to make sure it's not cost prohibitive, right? So like if we are building things that are too expensive, whether it be because the technology is too expensive, the storing the data is too expensive, whatever it is, that's going to be cost prohibitive. Our practices, any kind of small doctor, one doc, two doc practices are going to have a very hard time paying for something that's not kind of imminently driving ROI for them. So all those things need to be taken into account as we really think about how to drive adoption at the kind of community or kind of more rural level.
One of the things that you hit on was really kind of balancing, between safety and innovation. And I know you serve as, the vice chair of the AI task force at the EHR Association. And I was curious if you can kind of share with us a little bit about, how you think about those two things. How do you do those things well together? Because a lot of times I feel like when people think of regulation, when they think of safety, they think of taking the most risk adverse position and not trying to innovate as fast. And I think that's the general sentiment, at least from I would say like the startup community. But I think specifically in digital health and kind of the space that we both of our companies play in, it's so much more nuanced than that. And so it's just such an important part of product development, product discovery, and what you actually deploy. I'm curious if you can kind of share with us a little bit about your stance on that.
Yeah. No, I think this is gonna be like one of the more interesting questions that we have to grapple with over the course of the next several years, right? Like, what is that balance between technological advancement and safety? And so much of it is going to be contingent upon what happens in the regulatory space. Do we have robust, comprehensive AI regulations that are industry specific, right? Like one of the biggest things that we advocate for at the EHRA. So we're a trade organization that represents all of the EHR vendors. I serve as the vice chair of that task force, like you said. One of the biggest things that we advocate for is like a carve out and understanding of industry specific AI use cases, right? So, we need to take a very industry specific approach and understand the inherent risks in healthcare, AI, but also that, all industries are not created equally. And then even within that, the understanding that not all AI use cases are created equally, right? So if we're talking about tools that are driving administrative kind of efficiencies versus tools that are, potentially making independent clinical decisions, those are very different risk profiles. And we need to take that into account as we think about how we regulate in this space. I will say though, I think most technology vendors, inherently would love a world where there's, I think the assumption is they love a world where there's no regulations, like, right, we can just move fast. We can, trust us. We're going to do the right thing. History doesn't fare well in technology for always doing the right thing. And what I will say is that in an industry like healthcare, we do have to be thoughtful about, what our responsibilities are here. One thing that I will say is that, and I always go back to that AMA survey because it's the most comprehensive view that we have on physician sentiment in this space. And the one thing that is kind of very unanimous amongst physicians is that they have a desire for some sort of regulatory framework around AI in healthcare. So there is a desire there. And I think that as technologists in the healthcare space providing tools for providers, we have to take that into account, right? So we have to understand that they want to make sure someone's kind of, keeping things on the right track. So there is a kind of a desire there. That being said, I do think we have to find some regulatory frameworks or some, middle ground between innovation, speed, and kind of like safety and efficacy. The kind of the things that I always focus in on that I think are most crucial to being able to do this, and something that, in lieu of regulations, I think I always advocate for when I'm talking to technology providers and when we're thinking about kind of our innovation within at Flatiron, is that, transparency is so crucial, right? So like as a provider, I need to know, and I should know when AI is being used. I need to, and this idea of kind of, the phrase that they use in the industry a lot is a learned intermediary, or this idea of kind of like the physician or the physician in the loop, like keeping the physician as the kind of primary decision maker. Ultimately, I think that those are really key to driving trust amongst the physician community, right? So like before I'm actually making a final decision on especially things like a diagnosis, a treatment decision, I want to make sure that my physician has the last say in that, and that they are the ones pushing the button, say, yeah, that is what I want to document or what I want to treat the patient with. So that idea of, keeping the physician in the center of decision making, I think is really crucial to, like I said, driving trust, to making sure that we are balancing innovation and safety. And I think it oftentimes goes back again to partnership, right? So I think that this partnership between the physicians that are using it or whoever's using it in the hospital or clinic, and the technology developers is so crucial to being able to balance and continue to reinforce kind of some of those principles that we talked about.
Yeah, I think it's such an important dimension in making sure that we are able to deploy technology responsibly. I mean, I think one of the things that really shocks me sitting on the technology side is just really the pace of how the technology is advancing. And what I typically find sometimes is a lot of these governance processes, they require a lot of stakeholders to sign off on it. It requires a lot of buy-in. And by the time you kind of finish, coming up with your governance process, there might have been a completely new paradigm shift in how the technology works. And, I think it's just such a very important conversation to have because, I think there are some glimpses of the technology actually proving that, by leveraging the technology, you're able to provide better care, right? And that really puts kind of the, pressure on us making sure we can have the right frameworks and right governance process to get the technology out as soon as possible to the end users to make sure that every provider is able to practice at the top of their license and they're leveraging the latest and greatest technology so that you can improve the access to care and improve the quality of care that everyone's getting. And so yeah, I just really commend the work that you guys do because it's such a crucial part of it, right? Like we need to make sure that there's clear, you know, a clear roadmap on what it's going to take to actually implement this technology from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, and I think like, listen, I'm a firm believer. Like, I don't believe in the idea of process for the sake of process, right? Like, whenever you implement process, there should be a clear reason why. What I will say that as we've seen some of these proposed regulations at the state level start to roll out, I've been actually relatively impressed with the thoughtfulness that people are starting to bring into like, okay, how do we thoughtfully regulate this? I think there was a fear initially that, oh my gosh, they're going to come in with a very heavy-handed approach to, what do we need to do on the development front? And we're not seeing that right now. So I think that's good and that's reassuring. I think that, we always advocate that like, please don't, we need kind of guiding principles and guidance on what the outcomes are that you want to see. You want to make sure that this is safe. You want to make sure there's kind of, we're doing risk analysis on our tools, but like being overly prescriptive is never the way to kind of regulate something well, I don't think, especially in this space. And so I think that we're seeing that as far as trends. It'll be interesting to see again, I think this is a space that is changing constantly, and like please check timestamps on when we're talking about this because this may have changed within the last several weeks until this is actually airs. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what comes through. How do we comply? Does that slow the pace of change? What does that mean for the industry as a whole? A lot will change in the next several years on this front.
So, Stephen, we talked a lot about kind of the real world impacts of AI today. We talked a lot about, the balancing of safety and innovation. I'm curious, like, outside of kind of the administrative burdens that we're able to kind of alleviate for the providers through this technology, like, what have you been seeing recently that has really kind of caught your attention that is more kind of on the dimension of, hey, it's not about doing something that we can already do today better, faster, cheaper, but like, have you seen anything exciting recently where, wow, we can actually fundamentally change the way care is delivered and do something that, wasn't previously possible without this technology?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things come to mind, right? So I think like one of the big, especially in the oncology space, one of the biggest areas of investment is going to continue to be in drug development, right? So like, how do we leverage artificial intelligence as we think about, cancer biology, targetable mutations, diseases that are very small in number that don't have the research funding behind it? How do we really leverage technology now that we have the data, right? So like, this would go nowhere if we didn't have the data to understand cancer genomics, cancer genetics a little bit better. So I'm very excited to see how does this change the landscape for kind of broader clinical research and at the basic science level. I'm not the perfect person to kind of go through all the nuance there. There's much smarter people that are doing this that are I'm so so impressed with, but it would be very flat-footed if I didn't talk about how incredible that is and what that, like how revolutionary that's going to be. As I think about bringing things to the point of care, because I think that's where I'm most interested in. That's where I spend the most headspace thinking about. My whole thing is like, how do we bridge the gap between what is happening at, the biopharma level, at the academic level, at like this incredible innovation? How do we bridge the gap to point of care, right? How do we bring that to them faster? How do we disseminate information? Whether it's through, in journal articles, in publications, in recommendations, in guidance from NCCN and other entities, whether it's basic science research that's happening. How, as a clinician, that's primary role is to be practicing medicine and taking care of patients. How am I able to get that information into my brain, onto the paper, into the patient, faster, right? So I think like that is what I'm most excited to see. I think that, now being a little bit further removed from training, I see this conundrum or this thing that happens when you leave training where you spend 4 years in medical school and then, the ample amount of time in residency fellowship and all this postgraduate training. And all through that time you're learning, right? You're constantly learning about the most recent up-to-date trends. You're staying really up to date. And then the minute you stop, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, like it's really hard to keep up with the pace of change because your day is spent, as it should be, taking care of patients, right? So you've been trained to do this thing, you now have this job, and your primary role is to take care of patients. So when during that day am I supposed to stay up to date on all of the changing guidance information, basic science information that's coming out? And I think that's why there's a lot of oncologists and any specialists that have a lot of comfort in the academic environment because they're able to keep up with that pace of change a little bit more. They have more protected time to do that work. It's happening at their institution, so it's easier to get that information disseminated to them. But really, how do we make that more equitable across the places where care is actually being delivered? I think that something that was genuinely shocking to me when I started at Flatiron is the percentage of patients that receive their cancer care at a community setting. It's over 50% by most accounts. So that means that if you are diagnosed with cancer, there is, probably a more than 50% chance, 1 in 2 people will be treated in a community oncology setting. And so that means that not everybody has, I grew up in Los Angeles. Not everybody has access to 5 major academic hospitals within 30 minutes of where I'm located today. And so like, how do we really make sure that we're prioritizing that so that there is just a better distribution of high quality care? I believe so fully in the capabilities of these community oncology practices. The providers that we work with at Flatiron and our OncoEMR network are so inspiring. They are working tirelessly because they love their community. They love this mission. They're so mission driven. So like we as technology, vendors, as technologists, we owe it to them, right? Like we have made the decision, we're going to work in oncology, we're going to work in healthcare. Like I said, part of that should be hopefully mission driven. And so this is such an important problem to solve. So it's really okay. Now we have amazing data flowing out of, NCI, major academic universities, journals, publications, conferences. How do we take that? How do we distill that down, leveraging technology? How do we bring that to the point of care? And I think that's where, that's what I'm most excited to see. I really think that this will alleviate so much of this cognitive burden off the providers. I think this will make their lives easier. I think this will help with burnout. There's so much opportunity for what this will do for our provider network at OncoEMR and Flatiron, and also just the broader kind of set of providers that are providing care in a variety of different locations.
Yeah, I think you really hit on the urgency, right? I think standing from the vantage point that we both have, attending these conferences all the time, seeing the latest kind of technology that's being developed, it's very hard to watch that technology exist, but not be at the fingertips of those that are delivering care every single day. And I think that's where I think my internal motivation and what I'm hearing from you is like your internal motivation really comes from as well. I think another interesting point of that is that aside from the technology existing, right, I think there's a whole, second chapter of that journey, which is, once the technology exists, how do you actually integrate it into the clinical workflow in a way that fosters trust, in a way that fosters, a very seamless integration into the day-to-day, lives of the providers that would be leveraging this technology. And it's really interesting, right? I think there's a lot of research that has shown that you can't just send a provider hundreds of notifications and expect them to care, right? A lot of the doctors don't like being told what to do, right? They, to your point, go to school for years and years and years to be able to be an expert about of something. And I think part of the role that, I really appreciate you playing, especially at Flatiron and, in our partnership, is being able to kind of translate that, right? Because I think as technologists, we sometimes say, hey, this technology exists, use it. But it's very different to say, okay, like, how do we really thoughtfully and methodically, diffuse this technology in a way that, is actually going to generate user love.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's a really kind of interesting and often overlooked chapter of this journey and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we talk a lot about like, how do we make sure that we get the right information at the right time in the right place in the EMR? And I think like all of those things need to be true for it to be used and adopted and actually like driving value, right? So first and foremost, we need to make sure this information is correct, right? So if it's not correct, we're starting from a really bad place. And then, at the right time. So, we have to time it with where they are in their day, right? So are they in the middle of way too many tasks to be able to even register or think about what they're doing? What is that right time where we'll make an actionable decision that may change a treatment decision that needs to be made. And then like that location, right? Like where is the right place to be surfacing that information in your kind of your electronic medical record? I mean, what we know about the EMR is that people really don't like to, they like to log in once to one thing, and they don't like to do a whole host of things outside of the electronic medical record. So I do think that's something that we're really recognizing and prioritizing, right? So we're hearing this from our customers. We know this from research that providers really need stuff that's more kind of well embedded in the EHR so that they can do everything in one spot and are not clicking between different things, logging into multiple things, copying and pasting. It's really challenging. So that's something that we're really prioritizing for our providers, knowing that those 30 seconds mean something, right? Like people think, oh, it's just 30 seconds to log in. No, that is crucial to me getting out on time, to me, having a life outside of the office, to me not having a chart when I get home. All of those things are contributing factors and things that we need to be constantly thinking about.
So Stephen, just to kind of close out our conversation, one of the things that I think you would have an interesting perspective on, given kind of the vantage point you have, is like, what do you think founders like me or, technology companies or technology vendors, what do you think, you wish they knew? And on the flip side, if you're talking to, all the providers and all the users, what is something that you wish they knew?
That's interesting. My answer is probably the same for both, which is like, my job is really hard, right? So like if I were talking to a founder or someone that's trying to build tools for a physician's job is really hard. They're about like the everything about it. Your day is jam packed. The mental model by which you're trying to think through at a patient level, but all the other things you need to do, like their job is really hard. So like, please build things that are easier for me and make my life easier and make my patients' lives better and all of those objectives that we're working to, but just a recognition that like, this is really hard work. And I think sometimes you don't get that until you can embed yourself in those environments. So I always encourage people at my company, any kind of technology company, like if you're able to go and shadow a physician, please watch them go through their day and recognize how challenging it is. Most of us, we only have the opportunity to see healthcare delivered as a patient, right? So like you walk in and the physician, we do a great job. The minute we enter that room, we're smiling, we're getting through our day. We are not, hopefully, probably not all physicians do this, but we're not like overly burdening you with all of our, kind of qualms and issues. They exist. They exist the minute you walk out that door, you go back to your office, you have 20 million things, you have new people coming at you. So just a recognition on the kind of startup side or the technology side that like the life of a physician, the life of a, nurse practitioner, pharmacist, MA, front office, like people again that, they're choosing these jobs because they love what they do, but it's hard work. What I try to translate to the doctors is the exact same thing, that it is actually much harder than you think to build technology, right? So like there's this oversimplified kind of schema in a doctor's head, because I used to be this doctor that didn't understand technology. Now I'm a doctor that understands technology. There's this oversimplified schema of like, just put the button where I want the button to be put, right? Like, why aren't you doing that? It should take 2 seconds. Like, just do it, right? And they don't recognize the nuance in all of that, right? So you're one person, you might want the button there. There's 20 other doctors that want the button in 20 different places. So how do I acknowledge all of that? There are, usability issues that we need to think through. There is, interoperability issues, data transfer issues. Like, there's so many different things that exist that make building technology much more challenging than people recognize. I have, I would like laugh about it a lot, but like I'd have doctor friends would be like, I'm just going to build a new EHR. It's like, oh my gosh, by all means, like, best of luck to you. This is not that easy. I can tell you right now, it's a very challenging business. There's other things you can build. You'll build it a lot faster and it'll be a lot easier to make more money. So like, I don't advise it. But there's that like recognition that doesn't exist, I think, sometimes on both accounts. And I would just love for a little more empathy of like, being a doctor, being a healthcare provider is really hard work, and it's a lot of work. And, you're coming at it with as much, compassion as you can. And similarly on the technology side, this is not as easy as we kind of, would think or hope or perceive oftentimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really well, right? Like, where the magic really happens is in deep partnerships with all the right stakeholders, and making sure that everybody is kind of rowing in the same direction and understands kind of all the challenges and the constraints that everyone else has to deal with.
I think we can
So,
just do that. I think that's like a general life lesson, right? Like, you can always try to be a little more empathetic to what we don't know, and to try and understand the other side of what someone's going through. And I think like if we all did that across a lot of different things, we'd be in a better spot. But
yeah.
that's my TED talk for the day.
That's a great message to end this on. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated all of the insights that you shared with us. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, great to be here.